Thanks, Mark, for that very lengthy introduction. I got tired just listening to it, remembering all the work I had to do for those books, but it was nice of you. And thanks to the members of the committee who invited me. Thanks to the Kephart family, whom I've enjoyed getting to know just a little bit. And Laura Kephart sounds indeed like a person I would have liked to meet. Sounds a very interesting person. I want to start tonight with a brief, very scholarly video that helps explain why, even though there are already thousands of books about Luther, historians are still writing a whole lot more, not to mention still holding all sorts of conferences and giving all sorts of talks. ...2017 is a big anniversary of a big religious event. It's been 500 years. Can you guess, if you had to guess, what would you think happened in 1517?
1517?
What?
Go ahead.
You picked the worst person for this. You may want to not waste your time with that video.
I would have no idea, I'm sorry.
I'll bet you've heard of it.
Do tell.
Oh. No, I don't know.
Well, I know what happened.
Is it the Bible?
Some people must have died. There was a hanging here, there.
Crusades? No, that was earlier. Ooh, is this the Mayflower?
Good guess.
It was the Mayflower. Oh, people got thrown out to the... No. Okay.
That was later.
No, wait. I didn't do a good job at history. I'm sorry.
I'm gonna say... Let me think.
What is his name? I forget his name.
Dang, I think it's like Mark something.
Not too sure.
Martin.
You should tell me his name. Martin Luther King?
Martin.
My history's so bad. Luther King.
Oh, Martin Luther King! He can't be that old.
No.
Oh, help me.
Luther.
Okay.
Martin Luther King. The main or prominent figures in my mind around that time would be Martin Luther.
Very good.
I want to say something along the lines of Martin Luther, but I'm probably off.
No, you're
Really?
exactly right.
Oh my gosh, yay! I know something.
What do you know about him? What did he do?
He didn't let him just him off the bus. He stood up for himself.
The English monarchy wanted to impose something or other, and he said, hell no, and broke off and got his own church.
That is a great guess.
Thesis of Nicaea, something like that? Nicaea, thesis of...
Was that the 29 Theses? How many theses was it?
It's 10 theses, something like that.
Is that the 99 thesis that he did?
Was it 101 or something?
He nailed the 50 theses,
On the door.
He nailed 100 theses.
96, I think it was.
This is 95 Theses.
Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the Wittenberg door.
That's when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses.
Whether or not he nailed that onto the Catholic Church door is debatable.
Any idea what profession he had if he was writing theses?
He was a writer?
Yeah, he was definitely a writer.
Was he a crusader?
Was he like a professor?
Well, he was a theologian.
Yeah, exactly.
So he was a professor at the University of Wittenberg.
I don't remember what else,
Indulgences
honestly.
or something?
Something like that.
Do you have any idea what an indulgence is?
Yes, but not in the sense of maybe what you're talking about.
They still sell them in Mexico. This day, that's no joke.
Like food or drink or?
Yeah, I do that every single Saturday with ice cream, so.
So indulgences were a fee that you would pay to remove the temporal effects of sinning.
And so he thought that some practices needed to be changed or reformed.
Please tell me you've been prepped for this interview, right?
15 You're not supposed to still be recording.
Pass.
I passed, okay.
Yeah, and shut it off now? I'm okay.
All right, are we done?
Yes,
Thanks, sorry.
thanks so much. That's so nice of you.
Ask me anything you want about the Dallas Cowboys. I can tell you.
Were you a plant?
Right.
Thanks a lot.
This was fun.
Thanks.
That's good.
Were we trying to see how far I could go?
Yeah, you did great.
Did I really?
Yeah. All right, well, I was very proud. This was all taken in Salt Lake, right, that film, and I was very proud of that missionary right out of Central Casting, who absolutely nailed the answers. I was shocked that any, Mormon missionary would know this. And also the one student who, by the way, is a computer science major. he listened very well in his History of Civilization class. May he be an example to all of us. Well, this year has seen even more books, conferences, and talks than usual because it's the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, or more precisely, of the year that Martin Luther put together his famous 95 Theses. Most of the commemorations going on, understandably and maybe even rightly, focus on the consequences of that original event, even more than on the event itself. The reason to commemorate something is because it still has some kind of connection to us. And make no mistake, the consequences of what Luther did were so big and the connection so strong that they are being commemorated not just by all the oddball scholarly societies we expect and love, but by all the markers of genuine fame in our world, including Legos, bobbleheads, T-shirts, beer, this is a very popular beer, I understand, and socks. This might be my favorite, though. But before we can discuss the consequences of Luther's actions, before we can say how they are still with us, we first have to get those actions as right as we can, or how in the world can we say anything meaningful about what followed? One consequence of focusing on consequences and after effects is that the original event can get blurred, or more likely distorted into something the original actors wouldn't even recognize. We skip or embellish or emphasize the parts we like, or tell the story the way we want it to have happened. Or most of all, we turn the actors into bronze statues we can't even relate to. For instance, what almost always comes to mind about the 95 Theses is an unwavering Luther nailing them defiantly to the door of the nearest church while crowds of people eagerly watch. Yet he may not even have posted these particular theses, as we'll see. And even if he did, there was nothing dramatic in doing so, since the church door in question was the bulletin board of his university. And theses and other things were nailed up there all the time. A more accurate board would be something like this from the Luther movie, which got a lot of things right, or wrong, but got this right. And here he is with his paper, with his big 95 Theses, covering up all sorts of other papers so that he gets the attention, and pretty soon somebody else came along and covered up his. So the act of posting had all the drama of a professor thumbtacking something up in the student center. But the defiant and crowded image is the one that's won out and has led to misinterpretation of what he intended and what followed. Well, getting old events right is even more than just for the sake of being able to trace their connections to the present in a genealogical sort of way. Getting events right is also to give us a chance to connect to them more directly by imagining ourselves in another world and pair of shoes in a semi-experiential sort of way. As Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, history has to be immediate to be meaningful. The fact narrated must correspond to something in me to be credible or intelligible. We, as we read, must become Greeks, Romans, Turks, priest and king, martyr and executioner, must fasten these images to some reality in our secret experience, or we shall learn nothing rightly. This mindset isn't about history as the past, but about gaining insight for life right here and now. The semi-experiential approach to old events is also behind a long tradition of meditation practiced in Catholic religious orders, like the Passionist monks I studied this past summer. If you want to understand Jesus' passion, they say, it's not enough to ponder a little corner of Palestine 2,000 years ago. Instead, you have to actually put yourself there in the moment, see it right in front of your feet, practically touch and smell and hear it. Then you might begin to understand how it went and what it might mean for you. And again, to try that, you first have to get that old world as right as you can. Trying to get Luther's world right and putting readers into the middle of it is what I've been doing over the last few years in the book that Mark mentioned and that has, by miraculous coincidence, just appeared. And what I'll try to do in abbreviated form today. When the editor asked me whether I was interested in writing a book about Luther's early years of fame, I protested that I wasn't a Luther specialist. He said, "Oh, I know." And I thought, wait, is this like Jerry Seinfeld getting an Emmy because he's not a good actor? And it turns out it sort of was, because the editor wanted something by a non-specialist for other non-specialists, and I was apparently eminently qualified to do that. Now, getting events right should be easier than getting consequences right, since consequences can run in so many directions over so many centuries. For instance, my friend Brad Gregory and I spoke together recently at a 500th anniversary conference and agreed that I would treat the events of Luther's first few years of fame, and he would treat the consequences of the remaining 496. But getting those early events right is harder than I expected. Usually historians of the Reformation don't have enough documents to tell their stories. But in Luther's case, the opposite is true. There are impossibly many, and they disagree with each other and still don't tell you everything you want to know. Not even specialists can agree on all the details of what happened. But we still have to try, because we want to talk ultimately about those consequences. The main outlines of the story may or may not be familiar to you, but I hope some of the context and shading and immediacy of events will be interesting. Luther was born on St. Martin's Day in 1483 in the Duchy of Saxony in the Holy Roman Empire, or roughly modern Germany. His father Hans had a copper smelting business near the town of Mansfeld, while his mother Margareta made sure Martin got the schooling he needed to stay out of the smelter. And Martin did well enough in school, meaning he learned Latin, to go on to university, which only 1 in 100 people in his world did. To understand Luther, you have to understand the university culture that did so much to shape him. He earned 2 degrees from the University of Erfurt, a Bachelor of Arts in 1502, meaning the first 3 liberal arts of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and then in early 1505, a Master of Arts, meaning the remaining 4 arts that you see there. If you wanted to study beyond the arts, you had 3 choices: a master's in theology, or law, or medicine. Father Hans, like most good fathers, wanted Martin to study law so he could help run the family business and get into politics to help promote that business. And Martin went along, starting his legal studies in May 1505. But after about a month, he suddenly announced that he was quitting to become a monk. It wasn't entirely clear why. Martin said that God gave him no choice. He might have been referring to a terrifying thunderstorm that made him vow to become a monk if he could somehow survive the storm. He might have been running from civic authorities, as there's some evidence that he killed somebody in a duel, which was a nagging problem at universities among students. He might have been trying to escape a marriage his father had arranged for him. But most of all, he might have meant that God was making him fret more than ever about his soul. Was he really ready to stand before God, he wondered, after the deaths of a couple of friends? The best way people in his world knew to get some extra favor on Judgment Day was to die in the habit of a monk. Whatever lay behind the decision, Father Hans was furious, but Martin went ahead anyway. On July 6, 1505, he held a farewell dinner with friends to announce his decision, something like National Letter of Intent Signing Day, where you see, yes, here we have somebody signing with Villanova, with the habits of the Augustinians, Franciscans, and Dominicans laid out in front of him. And he chose the Augustinians. Maybe it was because they were the only order willing to accept his possibly tainted self, but more likely it was because they were strict, which was good for his soul, and also because of their tradition of learning. Young Martin wanted to keep studying, after all, just not law. The answer to his struggles, he sensed, lay not just in the discipline of the religious life, but in the study of theology. He might also have chosen the Augustinians because they were not actually monks, but friars. Friars looked and acted a lot like monks, but they didn't withdraw from the world completely. As a friar, he could even study at the university where the real action in theology lay. The first year or so of Luther's new life did help to soothe his soul a little. If entering a friary improved your chances at salvation, and entering a strict one improved your chances even more, then being the most strictly obedient friar in a strict order just about had to guarantee it, he thought. But soon after making his final vows in 1507, he started having his troubles and temptations again. Not the classic temptations we might imagine friars having, like lust or gluttony, but instead the thought from the devil that he, Martin Luther, could never possibly be saved. No matter how hard he tried to do things perfectly, no matter how much penance he did for the times he slipped up, he still felt that God would never accept him. He also started studying theology in 1507, but that didn't help as much as he'd hoped. The Theology of Salvation taught at most universities came from thinkers called scholastics, who had long worked to build a rational system of Christian theology using the methods of those masters of rational thought, Plato and Aristotle especially. Luther learned plenty from the scholastics, and in many ways he was one himself, but he could not accept their answer to the question of how you were saved, because their answer was this: just do all that lies within you, and God will do the rest. Even if that answer worked for many people, it wasn't working for him. How could he know he was doing his best? There was always more he could think of doing. He also doubted the premise of do all that lies within, which he was sure did not come from the Bible, but instead from Aristotle. As a good pagan, Aristotle claimed that humans had enough good lying inside to do good and thus improve themselves. Luther was now sure they didn't have enough. Christian scholastics They didn't even think they had enough. Humans would never have enough good lying inside to actually save themselves, admitted the scholastics. Instead, they were ultimately saved or justified by God's grace, as the church had always taught. The question was, how did you get that grace? Here was where the scholastics showed their agreement with Aristotle and disagreement with Luther. You did have enough good inside, said the scholastics, to do enough good to at least get your soul to a sort of halfway station between sin and grace. And at that point, you could then cooperate with God in order to do what was necessary to receive the full measure of grace necessary for salvation. In short, this was justification by grace through doing every blessed thing you possibly could. Luther's perplexed confessors kept recommending this idea whenever he despaired about his latest trivial sin. You don't have to be perfect, they said. Just do all you can. But hadn't God commanded him to be perfect, responded Luther? Hadn't the Augustinians told him that he'd someday be able to keep all of their rules perfectly? So, to him, every single sin mattered. And why should he believe Aristotle, who was fine for reasoning and earthly subjects, but he didn't know a thing about Christian salvation? Luther kept studying, and he did so well that his superiors wanted him to take both a master's of theology and a doctorate and become a professor of biblical theology at the new University of Wittenberg. He was made Dr. Martinus in October 1512 and started lecturing in 1513, not quite 30 years of age. Of course, while he lectured, he still kept studying, most urgently on the topic of salvation, and now in sources outside of scholastic theology. He found some relief in monastic theology, which said that the key to salvation was to admit how sinful you were and beg God to save you. This was justification by grace through humility. He could do that. But soon the same question arose as with, do all that lies within you. How humble did you have to be? Humility became just another good work with which you tried to earn salvation. Luther found more comfort in the church fathers, including Augustine, who said that to do anything truly good, God had to first fill you with his grace at his initiative. Luther also learned from the spiritual writers later called mystics, who were Gelassenheit, or completely resigning yourself to your sinfulness and passively letting God fill you with his grace instead of trying to prove to him how humble you were. And Luther learned from the movement later called humanism to study the Bible in its original languages, not the Latin translation favored by the church. This helped him understand things afresh, like the Greek word metanoia, which didn't mean do penance, as it has always been understood, but coming to your senses. Penance wasn't about good deeds, but about your heart changing. As early as 1515, when he started lecturing on Paul's letters to the Romans, Luther began bringing these pieces together into his own comforting theology of salvation. Like the monastic tradition, he was sure you couldn't do anything to save yourself. Like the spiritual writers, he was sure all you could do was open your heart to God's grace. And although he agreed with Augustine that you couldn't do any good unless God first filled you with grace, he disagreed that the point was then to do good deeds that would change you and thus save you. No, he was also sure from Paul that your good deeds couldn't change your sinful nature, even after you'd received grace. You were still a sinner. The difference was that your sinfulness was no longer held against you. It was like Boaz putting his cloak on Ruth in the Old Testament. She was still Ruth, but she was now covered with grace. And covered like this, you naturally did good works out of gratitude for the grace that you'd received and out of love for your equally needy neighbor. In other words, works didn't save you, but were a consequence of God's grace. In short, this was justification by grace through faith alone. This was his big idea. The foundation for the rest of his theology is justly famous, is the idea that freed him from his torments. No wonder he had always felt unworthy, he realized, no matter what he did. He was unworthy, and so was everybody else. He wasn't the first to arrive at faith alone, though, as he himself stressed. Simon Fidata and Gregory of Rimini had said very similar things 2 centuries before. So at the Council of Orange in 529, a few of his contemporaries were saying the same thing, including his Augustinian superior and mentor Johann von Staupitz. In other words, Luther's view was very arguably within the Catholic tradition. All three of these views were. The problem was, it wasn't the view the church was choosing to stress at the moment, and might get him into trouble if he pushed it too hard. He decided he had to declare it anyway, because surely other tormented people were waiting to hear this good news too. As a sworn to orthodoxy professor of theology, he was perfectly authorized to clarify doctrine that hadn't been entirely settled by the church. In fact, that was his job. And justification was precisely such an unsettled doctrine. There was not universal agreement about how it worked. The best way any professor knew to go about trying to settle a doctrine, in fact, their knee-jerk reaction when they spotted such a thing, was to write up a bunch of theses for a disputation. There had been three forms of instruction at European universities since the start, around 1100: lecture, recitation, or review sessions, and disputation. To have a disputation, you needed something to argue about, and that's where the theses came in, or as they were usually called at the time, articles or propositions. And so a professor or a student would write some up, and some other people would dispute them. You could write any number of them, from 3 to 900. It didn't matter. What mattered was to compose as many theses as you needed to address all parts of the unsettled subject, in the hope that the disputation over them would yield some clarity. The theses were supposed to be provocative, even exaggerated, in order to bring out the issues fully. You didn't even have to believe them. When the theses were written, they were given to the disputants so they could prepare their proofs or explanations for or against the theses, which they would then present during the disputation. There were practice disputations every Friday at Luther's University, especially for students, and there was the occasional public disputation at graduations and other big events, because what better way to celebrate something big than with several hours of fine-sliced arguing in Latin? And so in the summer of 1517, Luther decided to draw up a set of theses for what he called a disputation against scholastic theology. It wouldn't be against all aspects of scholastic theology, but mostly the scholastic theology of salvation. What a huge event it would be, he was sure, because it would question some widely held views in the most public forum most professors could imagine. Theologians everywhere were sure to be upset, he thought, maybe only because they had to redo their syllabi. But he hoped that some would be persuaded to his side. He finally stopped writing when he got to 99 theses. Numbers 43 and 44 made the main point against scholastic method. It is an error to say that no man can become a theologian without Aristotle. Instead, said 44, no one can become a theologian unless he becomes one without Aristotle. Thesis 40 made the main point on salvation. We do not become righteous by doing righteous deeds, but having been made righteous, we do righteous deeds. Mindful of the uproar this would cause, he added a disclaimer at the end. The theses contain nothing that is not in agreement with the Catholic Church and the teachers of the Church, he said. He then either had a secretary take them to the printer, or he took them himself, as the printer would make, at the author's expense, several dozen copies for people at the disputation and for those who couldn't attend but wanted a copy as well. To publicize the disputation, he, or more likely, the university beadle, who kind of did all the go-to work for the university, would walk to the southwest corner of town and glue or nail the theses to the door of the university church, which was the church of the castle of Prince Frederick of Saxony, which was, again, the university bulletin board. The big disputation was held in that very church in September 1517 at the graduation ceremony of one of Luther's students, and some sparks surely flew, but more heads surely nodded. There was no big reaction at all. A couple of Luther's old professors at Erfurt weren't happy, but that was about it. The disputation ended with a thud. Yes, justification through faith alone became the basic foundation of later Protestant movements, and it was the thing Luther most cared about. And yes, some academics and the Pope would soon see the implications, but they wouldn't declare Luther's view heretical until 1545. In 1517, it was still Catholic enough, and so most people just yawned when he had his disputation. Dr. Luther was just doing his professorly thing, disputing unsettled subjects. Still, the disputation mattered at the moment, especially for showing that Luther was prepared to put his reading of the Bible above the church's reading. This willingness would be even more fateful in the next issue he got involved with, which provoked a lot more than yawns. And that was, of course, Indulgences. Luther first encountered them when in 1514 he became, in addition to professor of theology at the university, also the official city preacher at the city church. He thought Indulgences were trivial, but when he saw how popular they were among his parishioners, he decided to study more. Indulgences, or kindnesses, had existed since around 1100 as part of the sacrament of penance. Of the 7 sacraments in the church, penance was the one you did most often in your life, and it required 3 things every time, as many of you surely know: being contrite about your sin, confessing your sin to receive absolution, and doing satisfaction, or in Latin, doing enough, which meant some sort of this worldly punishment to help make up for your sin. This could be a pilgrimage or prayers and so on. But sometimes you just couldn't carry out your punishment because you got sick, or maybe you died. So how could you make it up? And yes, you did have to make it up, even if you died, because every sin had to be paid for at some point. The church offered 2 solutions meant to be merciful. The first was purgatory, after you died. But everybody knew that punishment there hurt like hell, way more than on earth. And so even better was the second way, an indulgence, a document that changed your punishment to something more manageable in this life, usually some sort of offering. In 1485, the Pope declared that indulgences could also be had to get your dead loved ones out of purgatory. In a world terrified of both sudden death and purgatory, indulgences became understandably popular. They were also popular for financial reasons among princes, bishops, and towns who were allowed to use proceeds from indulgences to build things like churches or bridges or, yes, university. The city church of Wittenberg and the University of Wittenberg, where Luther preached and where he taught, were built from indulgences. Indulgences were like bonds today. Luther concluded from his early study of indulgences that they were fine if they were rightly taught and understood. The problem was they weren't. They'd come to be seen as a straight financial transaction that forgave sins and kept people out of purgatory altogether, rather than as just forgiving the temporal punishment assigned to sin. Luther wasn't the first to see this misuse. Various theologians had criticized the same thing for centuries, and some had gotten in serious trouble for it. But he decided to join the chorus anyway, for the first time during a lecture in class in 1514, and then in 1516 in the university church, once again, where he preached more publicly against them. That church, remember, was kept up by indulgences, owned by Luther's boss and prince, Frederick of Saxony, who was more or less the biggest indulgence seller in the world. Although Luther dared to complain about Frederick's indulgences, what really irked him was a brand new indulgence from Rome that showed up in German lands in early 1517. It was called the St. Peter's Indulgence, since the offerings would be used to rebuild St. Peter's Cathedral. A building project like that was a routine enough goal of an indulgence, but what wasn't routine to Luther were the exaggerated promises it made of forgiving sin and keeping you from purgatory, instead of just changing your satisfaction for sin. Luther's mentor, Staupitz, urged him to do something more serious than usual this time. Not just a lecture in class or a sermon at church, but the biggest weapon and forum that a professor of theology thought that he had available to him, a full-blown public disputation at the university. And Luther agreed. Why shouldn't he? Indulgences were another unsettled doctrine. He was a professor of theology, so a disputation, a new set of theses, were just what the doctors ordered. In September or October of 1517, soon after the disappointment of his disputation against scholastic theology, he started writing another set of theses for what he called a disputation on the power and efficacy of indulgences. He wanted to have them ready by All Saints' Eve, October 31st, because the day after that, All Saints, was one of the biggest days of the year at the university church for pilgrims coming in search of indulgences. And maybe also because it was a traditional day at the university for posting theses for upcoming disputations. The problem was, indulgences weren't just any unsettled subject for theology professors to dispute, and that was because of who was in charge of them, the Pope himself. Indulgences were possible because the saints in Christ had done more good works than they needed to be saved, and that excess was deposited into a treasury of merits, controlled by the Pope, which he then distributed in the form of indulgences to help make up for your unfinished punishments, and now maybe your sins too. If you criticized indulgences in a disputation, his friends warned, then you ran the risk of criticizing the Pope too. The two were connected. But Luther went ahead, insisting, I'm not going to write against the Pope or even indulgences. I'm only going to write against their misuse. And this time he wrote until he had 95 theses. Most did indeed avoid the Pope, but as his friends predicted, not all of them. 8 of the theses stated, What were priests to say to lay people who asked such things as, isn't the Pope rich enough to build St. Peter's himself? And isn't the Pope merciful enough to let people out of purgatory for free? Plus, Thesis 32 disputed that anyone buying the new indulgence could be sure of salvation. Instead, it said they could be sure of damnation. Luther had the usual few dozen copies printed for disputants and friends. He might have also walked down and posted them on the university church's door, as the legend goes. But he very well might not have. The best clue of this is that no disputation was ever held at all on the 95 Theses. Luther was brave enough to write them, but he knew that princes had canceled disputations before that were on sensitive subjects, and maybe Frederick would cancel this one too. And so a safer course was to write them and send them around for comment, which is what Luther certainly did do on October 31st. He sent letters to 2 nearby bishops, attaching the theses as a PS, literally, and then sent letter and theses to Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz as well, who was in charge of the indulgence in German lands. As usual, Luther also sent copies to friends and colleagues, maybe hoping to entice them to come and dispute, but later saying he just wanted to talk privately among themselves. Of the 2 bishops who received the theses, one was enthusiastic, and the other responded that the theses were perfectly Catholic, but too sensitive to dispute. Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz never answered Luther. Instead, he forwarded everything to the Pope and complained. The last thing Albrecht wanted was some professor criticizing his indulgences in a disputation, because the big secret about the St. Peter's indulgence was that Albrecht was getting a cut of it too. Albrecht had borrowed 30,000 gulden to pay for various church offices he held. A craftsman might make 100 gulden a year. He'd borrowed that money from his banking friends, the Fuggers, back in 1514, and now it was time to pay them back. One of their accountants, or the popes, came up with a fairly predictable solution of having Albrecht allow a new papal indulgence in his lands. Half the proceeds would go towards St. Peter's, thus the name of the indulgence, and the other half would go to the Fuggers for Albrecht's debt. Given their long experience with indulgences in German lands, the Fuggers estimated that this new one would bring in about 73,000 gulden, half of which would easily cover Albrecht's debt. The big surprise in all this would have been if nobody had suggested this idea, because again, it was so common. But this indulgence had problems, even beyond the theological ones Luther saw. By 1517, German lands were the burned-over district for papal indulgences. People had spent vast sums on them for decades, and many believers had had enough, which was surely one reason this new one had to promise so much. And so Luther's criticism didn't help at all, and neither did his threat to go public with that criticism by holding a disputation, because what could be more public than that? Well, Albrecht complained to the Pope. His main indulgence preacher, Johann Tetzel, heard about the theses too, and went after Luther in, of course, another disputation. At a University of Frankfurt on der Oder, in over 100 theses of his own, which said that if the Pope allowed a particular custom in the church, such as indulgences, then that itself made the custom a sort of approved theology. Who was Luther then to say that indulgences were an unsettled question? If you were against the indulgences, you were against something the Pope had allowed, and therefore you were against the Pope. Precisely the logic Luther was trying to avoid, but that his rivals would always emphasize. Still, momentum was with Luther and not Tetzel. For the first and probably last time in Western history, a set of academic theses suddenly started selling surprisingly well. Some of his friends had taken their copies to a couple of printers in order to send to other friends, and pretty soon, profit-conscious printers who weren't going to print something unless they thought they could make money saw that there might be a market here. Not so much because people were so keen on the finer points of theology in the theses, but because they saw what everybody but Luther seemed to see, that they couldn't help but criticize the Pope. And at the moment in German lands, there was a market for such things. The Pope owned too much land, the Germans paid too many church taxes to Rome, and so on. No one could believe how the theses were spreading, including Luther. Pretty soon, all sorts of learned people all over German lands were reading and discussing and mansplaining them. This is my favorite picture of all time. He just needs a little sweater tied around his neck. But Luther wasn't happy at all when some other enterprising printer published the theses in German instead of Latin. Lay people would get the wrong idea if you did that because they didn't know the culture of disputation. We exaggerate, we posture, and they might think we're criticizing the Pope. And he didn't want that. But it was too late to recall the theses, so he decided he'd better explain himself a little more clearly in another sermon or another piece of writing. And so in February or March of 1518, he preached against indulgences again in the city church. And more importantly, and what opened his eyes, was that he had the main points printed in a short 8-page tract called A Sermon on Indulgences and Grace. It included the point of about only 20 of the 95 theses, because he wanted to focus on the things that lay people really needed to understand about indulgences, and that did not include any criticism of the Pope. This printed sermon, not the 95 theses, was the first great bestseller, selling about 24,000 copies in a couple of years. Luther also wanted to explain the theses more fully to the learned, especially the Pope, because he'd heard by now that his name was being smeared in Rome. And so he wrote another much longer tract containing not only the theses, but their proofs or explanations, the ones he would have used had there actually been a disputation. But the Pope wasn't impressed. And in April or May of 1518, his lawyers started a legal case against Luther. He was to come to Rome to answer for his theses, and if he wouldn't, his prince should arrest him and send him there. But Luther's prince, Frederick of Saxony, had other ideas. Although Frederick's indulgence-loving self did not love Luther's views on indulgences, he wasn't convinced that his professor was guilty of heresy. And no prince wanted to be known as having a professor convicted of heresy. So Frederick arranged with the Pope to let Luther be heard on German soil in Augsburg, where the Pope's delegate happened to be. Luther made the 300-mile trip there on foot in October 1518, arriving 3 hours before the deadline and sick, lying on a cart. I mean, this is so dramatic. You have to make a film about this. And he met with Cardinal Tommaso Cajetan for a very disappointing 3 days. Cajetan was a theologian, and so Luther expected to be able to explain his theses further and discuss the issues with him. But the cardinal stunned him by simply demanding that he retract the theses and submit to the Pope. Luther asked, couldn't he at least be shown where he was wrong? Cajetan had been ordered by Rome not to engage in discussion with Luther, but as an academic, he couldn't resist. Very well, he said. 2 of the theses, only 2 of the 95, mind you, met the test of heresy because they contradicted settled doctrine and church law on the subject of the authority of the Pope over purgatory and over the sacraments. Luther was ready for this, though, and here was the crucial point of the hearing. Those laws, he insisted, were based on biblical text that had not been interpreted correctly. They were therefore false and did not have to be believed. If he could be shown other biblical text that proved he was wrong, then he would submit to the Pope. But otherwise, he couldn't rely on the word of the scholastic theologians and the popes who had put those laws together. Now, Luther himself was turning the matter of indulgences into a matter of the Pope's authority. And that was far more dangerous than talking about justification by faith. Luther sensed the danger of doing this, and he got out of Augsburg as fast as he could. But once he was back in Wittenberg, he wondered, would he really be able to stay there? Surely the Pope would now declare him a heretic, and Prince Frederick would have to either arrest his own professor or protect a convicted heretic. And that was very dangerous because it would give other princes an excuse to invade your territory and your subjects not to obey you. But Frederick, in a rare show of his actual sentiments, told Luther to stay in Wittenberg. And he wrote Cajetan that if Luther were convicted of heresy, then of course he would arrest him. But until then, he, as a fair prince, couldn't treat any subject that way. Cajetan and the Pope backed off a little, but not just out of some sense of fairness. Prince Frederick, you see, wasn't just any prince among the 300 or so in charge of German states. He was an elector, one of the 7 who elected a new German emperor whenever an emperor died. It was not by heredity in the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, Frederick was the most influential of the 7 electors, And the current emperor was so close to dying that he was carrying around a coffin with him at all times. The Pope wanted Frederick to push a certain candidate for the office, and for almost a year, the illegal bribes that dominated every such election rained down from all sides upon all 7 electors, all the way until June 1519, when a new emperor was finally chosen. And it was not the Pope's man. Frederick had not backed that man, after all, and at that point, the Pope did not need Frederick anymore. But Frederick had succeeded in putting off any action against Martin Luther for a whole year. Another big event delayed the Pope for yet another year, and that was, what else? Another disputation. These were basically the pay-per-view prize fights of the time, and this one was held at the University of Leipzig to supposedly decide once and for all whether Luther was a heretic. Every disputation had judges, and if the judges of this one decided that Luther was a heretic, the Pope wouldn't need to put any pressure on any prince at all. The verdict would be clear for everyone, and no one could then protect Luther or claim that he hadn't yet been convicted of heresy. Luther's opponent at the disputation was his most formidable rival, Johannes Eck, a theologian at another German university. All of church Europe waited as the men disputed a measly 13 theses written by Eck. Not so much about indulgences, of course, which Luther had long wanted to dispute, but the Pope's authority. Eck was sure he could vanquish Luther on that point. Luther himself, tired of tiptoeing around the subject, decided to surprise Eck. He would take the subject head on, not just regarding purgatory, but the Pope's authority over the entire church, and amass so much evidence that Eck and the world would finally be convinced Luther was right. And so Luther prepared for months. He was already sure that the Bible did not support the Pope's authority. The usual texts used, Matthew 16 about the rock and John 29 about feed my sheep, were not interpreted rightly, he insisted. So for the disputation, he studied mostly church history. And to his surprise, he became convinced that the Pope's authority over the church was established only by about 600, that it did not extend to all of Christendom, like the Greek church, and that the documents confirming whatever authority the Pope did have came from only around 1100. The papacy was, in other words, a human institution, not a divine one established from the start. Now, it was fine as human institutions went, said Luther, and it served a unifying purpose in the church, and people should respect the Pope. But there wasn't anything about the office that made the Pope's word automatically divine. In fact, Luther was stunned at how many of the Pope's decrees, so often based on scholastic theology, contradicted Scripture in his mind. The Pope had erred with those laws. He could easily err about indulgences. And the test of error, this was the key, was the Bible. Eck was ready to offer contrary evidence, of course. The disputing went on for days like this, in a stalemate, until Eck tried another favorite tactic of disputations, guilt by association. Some of Luther's statements about the Pope, said Eck suddenly, sounded a lot like those by Jan Hus, who'd been executed for heresy a century before. And Luther took the bait. Well, he said, a lot of Eck's statements were actually quite Christian. The crowd gasped. That was all Luther's enemies needed to conclude that he was a heretic. He had agreed with a convicted heretic. The admission stunned Luther too. He'd been unpleasantly aware since March of the growing distance between himself and the Pope, but now admitting it in public was almost a shock to his system. The disputants went home a few days later, each sure that he had won the disputation, but the verdict was up to the judges, and they refused to decide. It was too tricky, they implied, for almost a year. During that time, sure that he'd be condemned and executed, Luther kept writing more desperately and critically than ever on just about everything, and often coming back to the matter of the Pope's authority, like in his Babylonian captivity of the church. He didn't want to reform the church, he insisted, because only God could do that. He only wanted to urge improvement, including in how it was organized. Maybe the church should be organized by state instead of around the Pope, and princes should protect it, while the church would more or less run itself based on the true word of the Bible. Surely that wouldn't be any worse than having the Pope run things, he now much more blatantly declared. And so in 2 years, he'd gone from calling himself the defender of the Pope to now blatantly attacking him. All this rioting and attacking made Luther more famous than he already was, and it also got the Pope to finally act. In the summer of 1520, 2 years after Luther's first summons to Rome, Pope Leo X issued a bull that gave Luther 60 days to recant his 95 Theses, and now much else too, or be excommunicated. And this was the bull against the errors of Martin Luther, called Exsurge Domine. Instead, Luther refused, and on the 60th day, he burned the bull and all of canon law, papal law, before a big crowd at the university. Here was where the crowd really was, not at the posting of the 95 Theses. Despite the bonfire, Prince Frederick managed to postpone excommunication by arranging yet another hearing for Luther at the next imperial diet or assembly to be held in the city of Worms. Thus, the Diet of Worms you have surely scratched your head and imagined unappetizing things about. Luther arrived in early 1521 as a folk hero, and the streets really were lined with his admirers, but not for reasons he would have liked. He would have wanted people cheering for justification by faith alone, but instead, the champion they imagined was someone who would lead a violent revolution against Rome, or free them at least from the tyranny of their local landlords. Luther wasn't for any such thing. When finally called before the Diet, Luther made his famous stand, even though he never said those words. Oh, oops, there's a more dignified one. Presented with all available copies of his books, he told the judges and the emperor that he could not recant them because he was sure they were based on solid authority, meaning, of course, text from the Bible. The emperor promised him safe conduct home, but a few days later, he got the Diet to declare Luther an outlaw, and he promised to go after Luther once he'd returned home safely. But on the way back to Wittenberg, Luther was kidnapped by knights working for Prince Frederick, and for the next 10 months, Luther was kept hidden away in one of Frederick's 12 or so castles, the loneliest one, called the Wartburg, where he wrote even more vehement things against the Pope and suffered temptation and epic constipation, and also translated the New Testament into German. While at the Wartburg, Luther was also finally officially excommunicated by Rome in October of 1521. In March of 1522, even though Frederick didn't want him back in public yet, Luther decided to return to Wittenberg after 11 months away. People there were squabbling over how to implement Luther's ideas, and he wanted that to stop. Luther wrote Frederick not to worry about protecting him, though. If the emperor should show up at the border, he said, let him in, but he had to go back to Wittenberg now. Through Frederick's political skills, which consisted mostly of delaying, and the support of sympathetic princes, and some good luck, Luther never was arrested. But he also had to stay in Saxony the rest of his life. Still, he died in bed in 1545 rather than at the stake, 1546, which surprised and even disappointed him, as he thought, his old temptation, maybe I'm not worthy enough to die for Christ. But nobody could have seen in 1518 or 19 or 20 or 21, when everything was up in the air and uncertain and nerve-wracking, that Luther would die in bed. Well, those are the crucial early events from which the consequences that were so weighty and so many, and that almost everybody else is writing about this year, followed. These early events were, of course, far more numerous and detailed and complicated and unknowable than I can convey here. But again, it's still worth trying to see them as much as possible as the actors experience them. Not, again, just to be pedantic or to trace consequences more accurately. It's not even about doing justice to the dead, as the great historian Garrett Mattingly used to insist. It's about doing justice to ourselves as well, especially when we write and read about the great or notorious. The more we idolize them or demonize them, the more we treat their stories as inevitable, as if the outcome were clear and meant to be, then the greater the distance we put between them and us, chronologically and psychologically, and the harder it is to learn much from them or to identify with them. Instead, all we can do is marvel or despise as distant spectators, like the ancient Greeks watching their gods. It's not always easy to relate to the great. In the first place, they probably do have extraordinary gifts and vices that we may not. But when we study the whole person and their time, and we see the tenuousness of the events that made them famous, then we can see connections to us as well. Sure, they lived in a different time and place, which is what makes it challenging to understand them as whole people. It's hard to do what Emerson urged, and to imagine ourselves as Roman or Turk or executioner or monk. But we can get a glimpse of that world if we work at it. A friend recently noted to me that historians like to say two apparently contradictory things. The past is a foreign country, and there's nothing new under the sun. Maybe that's because we say whichever is convenient at the moment. But more likely, I think, it's because both are true at the same time. The past really is wondrously other. But if we can manage to grab onto it, even by our fingertips, we can then work out how it's familiar too, and how we've seen this before. If we can get a sense of Luther and his world, then we can relate to his courage and fear and intellectual power and inconsistency and uncertainty and stress and prejudices, repetitiveness and really nasty temper. And we relate because the flaws can help us feel less alone in our own flaws. And the gifts can inspire us to find our own and be content with them instead of constantly measuring ourselves against them. But if we distort the great, and if we read their story as if it were meant to be, and imagine that Luther saw the end, the middle, and beginning, then we distort him, and again, ourselves. Things don't go that inevitably. For Luther, as for us, life was regularly uncertain and joyous and painful and terrifying. In fact, it is always, however you want to understand that term, an act of faith. Thanks for listening. So I'll be glad to take any questions, as Mark said. Turn it on.
At one point, you talked about Luther returning to a hero's welcome, and that he was welcomed for the wrong reasons. He wasn't being welcomed for justification by faith alone. And that raises a long argument about whether or not that teaching was the impetus for the popular uprising and the political uprising that followed. I guess what it asks is, wasn't Luther really kind of like somebody who had studied too long without enough coffee or sleep? And he had a form of scrupulosity, which the church knew monks got, and so he had to find a solution. But do we think that large numbers of Catholics in that period had the conscience of a Luther? Or had a conscience like Luther?
Luther, as you can imagine, has been the subject of many psycho-historical investigations by the famous behavioral psychologist Erik Erikson, right? And trying to study exactly these things. He seems to be a gold mine for these kinds of studies. And however valuable those are not, one thing it does seem really clear that he had an unusually sensitive conscience. So that's why I say that maybe the answer, do all that lies within you, was good enough for many Catholics. And the system of indulgences and pilgrimage, that might have been just fine for a lot of people. But it wasn't good enough for him. I'm sure there were others like him, though, because there were others who came to those same conclusions. And so this may turn out to be a matter of personality, more than just theological truth or something. I mean, for him, it was theological truth. I mentioned some of the people who had come to these conclusions before, but I suspect that there were many anonymous monks who went through this as well. This was their occupation, to look inside of themselves for sin. And you can always find something. And when you got so obsessed by it that you almost couldn't function, the monks called it the bath of hell, right? Over-scrupulousness, they called it. And so his mentor, Staupitz, recognized that he had this. And they were used to dealing with this. And that was one of the reasons he wanted to be a professor of biblical theology, because it would give him something to do, besides, worry about his sins. He was just too busy to worry about them all the time. And his whole life, he kept worrying about it. He'd come back, he'd have these bouts of really in 1527, 35, and then near the end, at the end of his life, he was really a crabby man. And he had these bouts of doubt again. So he had them over and over. It wasn't constant, but he did have them periodically. So for him, this was what it was all about. But for most people, no. And so I didn't mean to say that people were cheering him for the wrong reasons. They were cheering him for reasons he wouldn't have. He wanted them to cheer justification by faith alone, but he was mad his whole life that people didn't get it. And in 1530, and then again in 1540, there are records of him giving a sermon in the church in Wittenberg and stomping out during the middle of the sermon because people weren't living the way that he was, telling them to live. So this was the thing he cared about. This was what later Protestants, when they look backwards, that's another thing of reading the story backwards. You think, oh, this was obvious. No, that's not what people cared about at the time. Sure, over time, that came to be really important to the Protestant theologians. But at the moment, it was what made him famous was he was seen as this enemy of the Pope. And in Germany, that was very popular at the time.
I am a church musician, and my familiarity with Luther, of course, has to do with his composition of chorales and chorale texts. Was he allowed to practice freely as a priest after he was released from that castle back in Wittenberg and establish all of these wonderful new things in congregational participation, particularly with music?
That took a while. He didn't do that right away. The reason he went back is because they were arguing over how to worship. And some of the more zealous reformers wanted to implement his ideas right away. The Eucharist in both kinds, maybe some congregational singing, the Mass in German. And even though he had written in favor of that, because it was causing division in the community, he said, no, we're not going to do that right now. So when he came back, yes, he was a priest, and he preached. In fact, he wanted to show with his actions that he was serious when he said, we're not going to change things too fast, because there are too many who are weak among us. There are too many people who believe that in order to be saved, they have to have particular forms. So we're not going to change those right away, even though some of the rest of you don't think they're important. So
if it didn't happen right away, when did it happen?
The next few years. Yeah.
Next few, did you say?
By 1526. Yeah.
Okay.
So it was a few years before he really let that happen. When he came back, when he'd been in the castle, he'd grown his hair out, right? He didn't have a tonsure anymore. But when he came back, he shaved it to show that he was, and he put on a monk's habit to show that, I'm going to do things the old way so that we don't change things too radically and upset people. So the music stuff, that would come, in the next years. And he began composing at that time.
Okay.
Ironically, Leo X was also very good at music. He was quite a musician himself, had a really nice voice, and composed some songs. But Luther became a more famous musician.
Thank you.
The microphone.
Turned on? It is? You may have already answered this question, but the Catholic Church is a tremendous, large entity, like a big ship of state. And like any large entity, it takes a lot of work just to move it a little bit over time. About when in the history of the Catholic Church do some of these basic feelings seem to have taken some hold and shifted the ship some bit?
I mean, shifted in Luther's direction, or?
Just the behavior of the Catholic Church.
Well, there have been plenty of others besides Luther who are criticizing the church, who never left the church. Erasmus is the most famous, but it was almost a generational thing. A lot of the young humanists, as they were called, left with Luther, and a lot of the older ones stayed with the Catholic Church. And maybe the Holy Spirit works differently on old people and young people. You know, maybe these generational things really matter. So some people were content, some people weren't in the church. The church began to respond to Luther, but there were already reforms underway. He was one of only many reformers of Catholicism. And he happened to break away. He didn't want to break away. There were others who, again, stayed within the church. They weren't excommunicated. They even wrote against Luther and so on. So there was already a reform movement going on in Catholicism. In fact, some people argue that the 15th century was maybe the most religious century ever in European history. But often the scene is, the church was in such disarray, and that's why there had to be a Reformation to clear this out. In fact, there was more reform and more religiosity, arguably, in the 15th century than at the time, and expectations were higher. And Luther came into this, and he saw this basically as a series, or a lot of theological confusion. That's why he was trying to settle unsettled doctrines. The church then began to respond to Luther, specifically starting in 1545 with the Council of Trent, and it went right down the, by now, Protestant series of doctrines, and started with justification by faith, and just specifically denounced all of them. But until that time, Luther's view of justification could be said to be Catholic, and be argued. So so there was already a Catholic reform going on before Luther, and then 30 years after Luther came on the scene, there was a direct response to him and other Protestants who come up. Yeah.
Hi, sorry. You said that Luther was able to argue that the church had misinterpreted all the parts of the Bible that gave papal authority. What exactly was his argument for that?
The main thing is Matthew 16 and 18, where it says, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock," right? And Luther interpreted that for various reasons. The rock was the faith of the people. That Jesus never meant that Peter himself was the rock, even though his name, means rock, Greek. So rock was faith. Now, you could argue, just as you could about interpreting many texts, why is that? And he would have his reasons, but he never had evidence that convinced everybody. But that was mainly why. And it's like, you can't say that was from the foundation of the church, that existed. The real documents that gave the Pope authority came from much later. So it's a combination of church history, and it's a combination of his interpretation of Scripture. The main thing isn't just that he interpreted Scripture differently. It's that the Bible became the litmus test. It became the highest source of authority. This confused Catholics because they said, of course it's the highest source of authority. The question is, who has the right to interpret it, the ultimate right to interpret it? And of course that was the Pope. And that's what Luther disputed. That was the really fundamental thing about what Luther did. That was the most fundamental thing. It wasn't just that he came to this new view of justification. It was that he made the focus, or he chose a new source of authority. That we were all free from the Bible. He was sure that if everybody did this honestly, they would came to the same conclusion as he would. Right? I'm sure you don't know how many friends like this, or spouses, right? If everybody just looked at this honestly, you would see things the way that I do. And of course, it didn't work out that way. It just caused a lot more trouble, for good or ill. I mean, Protestants in some ways are proud of that division. And they're proud of what Luther did, even if it meant division. But many Catholics would see that and say, well, that's when, society fell apart. That's when religion could no longer be a part of public life. At least, that's how it resulted. At first, religion was still very much a part of public life, even after the Protestants came on the scene. But by 1650, and the end of the wars of religion, 130 years after Luther, everybody said, we are sick of killing each other in the name of religion. Let's go back to the old reasons we kill each other. lust and booty and then land, that we want. But we're not going to kill each other in the name of religion anymore. So that was when, it basically implicitly decided the least possible evil was to say religion is no longer part of public life because it's caused too much strife. And again, that's for good or ill. That's really when it began, and that's the legacy that continued into the present.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because what happens with Luther is we're going to decide to grapple with the text itself, right? To grapple with the Hebrew, but we're going to get rid of some authorities and we're not going to get rid of others, which is in some ways the problem, right? I mean, we have a whole history that we're sort of getting rid of, right? And then we have to figure out what we're going to pick and choose from, which is why things happen like the Catholic Bible and the Protestant Bible are going to be different. But the whole process is, as you talked about it, it's one that's going to start right away splintering, because who are we going to pick and choose from? Who's going to be important, who's not? Who are we going to keep? Exactly what part of the history is going to be important? What part of the history, right? So if you would talk a little bit about that, I would be grateful.
How do you choose that? Luther made a hierarchy, and he had various justifications. Again, I won't go through all the reasons, but he had justifications why he chose the hierarchy. First, he trusted the Bible. Then he trusted the church fathers. And only after that might he trust the scholastic theologians and church law. But if there was a conflict, he would always choose the higher authority. And of course, then it was his interpretation of the Bible, but he wouldn't see it that way. He saw it as the interpretation of the Bible that God had inspired. So I think that was, it really is complicated. If you think about it in class, one of the things we do is we try to encourage students to learn to think for themselves, confront the text yourselves. On the other hand, if you just turn them loose like that, what tools do they have to interpret it with? And the student's instinct is, well, I want to know what the authorities said. And that is the safer way. And you say, oh yeah, here there are lots of authorities who have said this or that. And so we're kind of torn. We want them to confront it themselves. We don't just want them to follow the authorities, but if they don't have any tools to begin with, it's really kind of an empty interpretation. So that's how the church saw Luther, I think. It's like, why would you not want the scholastic theologians, many of whom had been declared saints by the church? Why wouldn't you want the help of them since the Bible was so hard to interpret? And so it was just so puzzling to them when he said, the Bible is supreme, because they're saying, of course the Bible is supreme. And it was also puzzling when he said, no scholastic theologians. And they're like, why? The Bible is so hard. You need everybody's help that you can get. It's like a team effort, right? And then to just categorically dismiss them just seems silly to most Orthodox Catholic theologians. And so the impasse began. It was a matter of who you choose. I don't know what the answer to that would be. You would come up with intellectual justifications, but there might be psychological ones too. I mean, people have sought the psychological justification. Luther's rebellion from his father, it's the classic one. And therefore he's going to rebel from the church as well. Any authority figure he's just going to rebel from. And so that's why he said, scholastic theologians and the Pope are last. Right? Because the Bible, then he can interpret it the way he wants. Even though he's saying he's submitting to an authority, it's his interpretation, it's his authority. So maybe there's something to that. Maybe it's a matter of personality, maybe it's a matter of which ones you think spoke most beautifully or authoritatively. And so on. Even in Catholic theological circles, they also had favorites. They argued with each other. Some followed more Augustine, some other, medieval theologians. So Luther wasn't unusual that way either, but it was just the consequences of his action were so much bigger.
You talked about indulgences in the beginning.
Yeah. The question is about indulgences. Did they survive? They did. And that, didn't you see the guy in the video? He said, you can still buy them in Mexico to this day. I didn't say anything to him. I wanted to say to him, actually, you can probably get them in a lot of places. But they were reformed so that bishops had to get more, they were stricter about them. But they still continued very much in the same old way. The Council of Trent mostly reaffirmed what Catholics had already been doing. And including many of their practices. And one of them was indulgences, but it was much stricter control over those indulgences. They had to go through the bishop and so on. So the bishop would try to keep an eye on them and see that there weren't abuses, but I think they still were understood by many people in the same old way.
Given the importance of disputation, given the importance of disputation in academic circles at that time, do you believe that it was inevitable that eventually a monk or a theologian would have stumbled upon the idea of let's dispute indulgences and ultimately even get to matters like the papal authority? Or do you believe that it was the specific, very specific circumstances of Martin Luther combined with the historical time frame coming right after that period of Reformation within the church?
Right, that's the big question, isn't it? Inevitable that other monks would dispute this? They wanted to. There were other theologians who knew this was a problem. In Rome, they knew it was a problem. And so it was just too politically sensitive. There were a handful of subjects you just didn't want to dispute, and everybody, all the theologians kind of tacitly followed that rule. They just didn't dispute them. So what was different was that Luther had that kind of, and this is where, is it the context or is it the individual that makes the bigger difference in history, right? This is where Luther's personality really mattered. He had that stubborn personality of being sure that he was right. Even though he had his doubts, throughout his life periodically, he still was sure that he was interpreting this rightly. And he had enough nerve, not necessarily to hold a disputation or even to post the theses, but to at least write those theses and send them around to important figures like Archbishop Albert, right? And that's as big as it got in Germany. So his personality played a role there. And then the other thing that was so crucial was the protection of his prince. I mean, there might have been another Luther in some other state of Germany we never heard of because the prince wouldn't protect him and let them be accused of heresy because no prince wanted to be accused of harboring a heretic, right? So those circumstances really matter a lot. Inevitable, that's always a big word in history. So I don't like to look at it that way, but I mean, it happened. Luther's personality mattered and his prince mattered a lot, but people were already arguing about them and making fun of them. Erasmus wrote some hilarious things about indulgences. And yeah, the church didn't love Erasmus either. His works were eventually placed on the index of prohibited books in 1555 or so. But he wasn't necessarily excommunicated. He was criticized and marginalized in some ways. Anyway. Yes.
So you've spent time in your scholarly career with obscure people and now the great. And I was just curious whose company you prefer and why?
I think one reason I was drawn to obscure people is because they're not argued about nearly as much as Martin Luther, right? When I was asked to write this book, I thought, I realized how many people have a little part of the turf of Martin Luther, and if you tread on that turf, it's going to be trouble. And I think that's one reason I prefer writing about obscure people. On the other hand, people who like history are more likely to want to read about somebody they've already heard of. This is what it took me a long time as a historian to understand, but that professional writers probably understand very well. As you just keep writing biographies about famous people, and that's who they heard of. So I was talking with Mark yesterday, talking with one of his friends that he thought he was a professional writer, and it's like, people don't go into bookstores saying, oh, look, there's a biography of Luther. I wonder how that's different from this biography or that one. No, they just say, oh, look, there's a biography of Martin Luther. So on the one hand, it makes people inherently more interested, I think. You don't have to convince them that this person is worth reading about. But I still have a soft spot for the obscure people, mostly because I had to work so hard to find them. And because I usually find some document, in some miraculous way, it seemed like to me, when you find these documents and other people have experienced it, when you find them, it seems like a miracle, right? You can't believe you found something this good. Because most of the stuff you see is just so dull. And then all of a sudden, here's something that's so revealing and so exciting. So I always have a soft spot for them, I suppose, just because of that. It's like, here's something that nobody's ever really cared about, written about, and I've been lucky enough to find it. So I want to try to bring this person a little bit to life and to our consciousness and why they might matter to us, not just to some antiquarian story, but why that might matter in your life. So I think I like the obscure, I have to say. I mean, I really like learning about Luther. I mean, I've been teaching the Reformation for 30 years, and there were a lot of details I just didn't know myself. You know, I mean, and everybody I found out in the little person on the street interviews, everybody's heard of Luther, but can't really say what he did, right? and aren't really sure of that. And again, it's not just to be pedantic and to say, oh, you should know your facts. It's because really those things matter, you know, and the idea that society should be divided now into different confessions because now we've got this new locus of authority, the Bible, that revolutionized Western society, right? That eventually makes us say, okay, we've got to have a secular world. Not that we don't believe in God, but that we don't bring religion necessarily as easily into public life. We don't bring our particular confession anyway into public life because we can't communicate with each other if we do that. We just have different. So that was, you know, that's a tremendous thing. And so, but my mission was basically to try to understand what Luther did, and it was harder than it looked. And I'm sure many of you have heard the basic outlines of the story, but I'll bet you that there are again details that are just surprising. And I especially wanted to stress that academic culture. And because, he's writing 95 theses, people have the image he's got 95 protests against the Catholic Church. It's just more theses for disputation. You know, that was something that professors did all the time. And so Luther the professor was really who I wanted to stress. Maybe that's what's a little different. I think you're all indulgences out. But thanks so much for coming tonight.